Good morning, everybody. Welcome to your December 6th edition of Forecasting Space. I'm your host, Chase Wilson. Definitely a lot to talk about, both in terms of launches upcoming and space news. It's been a bit of a rambunctious last few weeks, and I think as we head into this last portion of 2024 and into 2025, space is going to get very interesting. So let's hop right into it. First, see what we have in store for launches for the next week. As for launches, the next one scheduled from the United States is over at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. This is tomorrow at 11:10 p.m. Starlink Group 12-5. Of course, most of the launches coming out of America these days are these Starlink launches, which of course launch big batches of satellites in the Starlink network, which is Elon Musk and SpaceX's internet project. This is at 11:10 p.m., so we'll be seeing another night launch for this, as well as a night landing, as this will be landing on the autonomous spaceport drone ship just off the coast. Next up on the list is actually a few days later. It's Thursday at 1:33 p.m. This one out of Vandenberg Space Force Base there on the west coast. This is also a Starlink launch. This one, Starlink Group 11-2. This is going to land on, of course, I Still Love You, one of their other autonomous spaceport drone ship vehicles here. So, like I said, you really see a lot of these Starlink launches. That's what's upcoming here. But we also see, just 1 hour after that, O3b mPOWER 7 and 8 launching on a SpaceX Falcon 9 Thursday at 2:58 p.m. on the east coast. So we're actually seeing kind of a double-header day here, that much is for sure, both in the daytime. In fact, these are second-generation satellites for the SES-owned O3b network. But besides this, we're not seeing much in the way of launches for the next week. The next one is Astranis Block 2. That's got a no earlier date than December 16th, but that could be pushed back. So for the week ahead, we're not seeing too many launches, but they're the typical suspects. That is to say, SpaceX from the continental United States. That wraps up our launch segment here. Not quite as much going on that front here for the next week or so, but I'll tell you what, this next segment covering rocket news, space news, things like this from the United States, there is a lot going on and a lot about to go on here. So let's hop right into it and see what we have to look forward to in the field of space for the next little while. Perhaps the biggest news coming out of the space sector over the last month is Donald Trump's appointment of Jared Isaacman as the administrator for his term in office of NASA. So over the next couple of months, we're going to see that confirmation process begin. Now, Jared Isaacman, if you're a space nerd or followed space in any capacity over the last couple of years, you'll know that name, because he, alongside a few other fellow commercial astronauts, actually went up into space, a part of the Polaris Dawn missions, as well as the Inspiration 4 missions, which was actually a charity project to raise money for children with cancer. And of course, he was also the first commercial astronaut to do a spacewalk. So this guy definitely knows his stuff about space, we'll put it that way. He's a billionaire. He actually started and found his wealth through the Shift4 payment company, which you've probably seen before. You might not even have thought about it. It's the company that actually makes a large portion of those credit card processors at restaurants, at stores, things like that. And he used his wealth for aerospace and space. And now, sure enough, his association with Elon Musk has moved him up to the rank of the preemptive, at least as of right now, depending on the affirmation process, NASA administrator, right? So this is going to be an interesting pick. And I say interesting because this is going to be quite a shift from the past. Right now we have Bill Nelson, who's done pretty good. He was a senator for the longest time, and he also went into space. And before that, we had Jim Bridenstine, who also was a senator. So we see this trend here over the last couple of administrators of politicians, career politicians, who kind of know the ins and outs of these programs. But this is going to be interesting to see a new set of eyes from someone who is more invested in space purely from a financial and technological perspective. I think this is going to be a big change for a lot of the projects that we've been seeing, kind of meandering in NASA. That's one way to put it, kind of political projects such as SLS, things like this, which, I'm not one to diss the projects, but they definitely have kind of expanded into a sort of untenable solution, right? $3 billion per launch. I don't know about that. I don't know about that, right? So it's going to be interesting to see if Jared Isaacman uses his pull to favor perhaps more commercial space opportunities, with Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket coming out, SpaceX with their Starship continuing to develop, as well as Falcon Heavy currently in progress, as well as other smaller companies like Firefly, which recently got more funding here, $175 million in funding, in fact, for the next year or so. So we have a lot of opportunities here for new commercial space to step in, where older companies, more legacy companies with these non-fixed price contracts, these cost-plus contracting gigs, kind of a flounder, to be honest with you there. So this is going to be a very interesting sector to watch. I use that word very deliberately because we're going to see this ramp up, I think, in terms of technology and investments in this over the next year or so. And I definitely think this is going to be something to keep an eye on. Also in the news, speaking of Blue Origin, we've been seeing a little bit of activity there on the Cape with their New Glenn rocket being stacked vertically and even venting at times. We're patiently awaiting its static fire. That would be the first full stack static fire of this rocket. And of course, this rocket threatens to kind of be a good competitor with Falcon Heavy, SpaceX's currently operational Heavy rocket. And this thing too will be reusable, right? This is the trend we've been seeing over the last 10 years or so of reusability, and one of the reasons SLS is kind of slacking behind, if you ask me, to be honest with you there. It's not reusable, it's actually using reusable components, but actually throwing them out after one use. So those 4 SLS rocket engines on the bottom, the RS-25, won't be reused, just as an example. But yeah, and nevertheless, back on New Glenn, back on Blue Origin, this is going to be the next operational Heavy rocket vehicle. So this is going to be exciting. This thing will also land on spaceport drone ships out in the ocean, actually in motion, interestingly enough. These things aren't going to be stationary, so that will be definitely very interesting to watch. Hopefully we'll get a launch or two here in 2025. Probably not going to make it here in this last portion of 2024, but nevertheless, it's very exciting to see this new contender of space, which could very well take over a good portion of the market in coming years. That concludes the news portion of this update here. Of course, we're going to hop into what I like to show as the picture of the week. I like taking a picture from James Webb, Hubble, things like this, and showing it off to you. I think this one is very, very interesting, and it's actually right in our backyard. Here we see a familiar planet, Jupiter, as seen in infrared by the James Webb Space Telescope recently. And I'll tell you what, this is an incredible new look at such a large planet. You know, we're used to seeing these swirling patterns with their beige, browns, and even grays and whites at times. But in infrared, you get thermodynamic properties. You get these properties of what temperatures are seeing in the different cloud layers and their thicknesses. And man, check this out. You can even see on the poles some slight hints of auroral temperatures, things like this. The bright, blinding white of the great red spot there showing an intense storm still raging after hundreds of years. And in fact, zooming in, you can even see smaller storms feeding into it from that subtropical belt. This is one for the books, in my opinion. You know, people think about James Webb and think about its capabilities looking at galaxies billions and billions of light years away, but we often kind of forget just how capable this thing is of looking at our very own neighbors here in our celestial backyard. This is one of my favorites. Next week, in fact, I'm going to show you Saturn too. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be going through the planets that it has imaged so far, and Saturn is really remarkable too with its rings, but this just has a special place in my heart because of all those swirling storms, and of course, as a meteorologist, I've got a bit of a soft spot for swirling storms, right? Needless to say. So this is really one of my favorites that we've seen over the last 10 years. Jupiter, of course, besides Earth, is my favorite planet. Hopefully you share that opinion because just look at how beautiful this is. That concludes this episode of Forecasting Space. Join me next week where, of course, we'll have more on the upcoming launches at that time, and any interesting space news we'll cover right here.